The morning light filtered through the grape leaves in shades of green and gold, casting dappled shadows across the terracotta tiles of the cottage's small patio. Lieutenant Columbo stood with his hands buried in the soil, a pair of worn gardening gloves protecting what his wife had always called his detective hands, though these days they seemed better suited to coaxing tomatoes from the earth than extracting confessions from suspects. He had been in Provence for 8 months now. 8 months of quiet mornings, the distant sound of bells from the village church, and the simple satisfaction of watching things grow. The cottage sat on the edge of Aix-en-Provence, surrounded by olive trees and the occasional vineyard. It was the kind of place where time moved differently, where a man could forget the weight of 35 years spent chasing murderers through the streets of Los Angeles. Mrs. Columbo had passed 3 years ago, and for the first 2 years after her death, he had simply gone through the motions of living. He'd solved cases. He'd closed files. He'd sat in his office at the LAPD, staring at the rain through Venetian blinds, wondering if this was all there was. Then one evening, sorting through her belongings, he'd found an old photograph, the two of them in front of a cafe in Nice, taken during their honeymoon in 1955. They looked impossibly young. She was laughing at something he'd said. He couldn't remember what it was anymore, but he remembered the feeling of her hand in his. He had retired the next day. The garden was coming along beautifully. The tomatoes were especially promising this year. He'd planted basil and oregano near the kitchen door, and there was a small herb garden that Mrs. Columbo would have approved of. He'd even attempted roses, though he suspected those would be a more complicated affair. Patience, though. He had all the patience in the world now. The sound of a car engine pulled him from his thoughts. Not the usual sound of the village traffic, something more urgent. A siren, distant but growing closer. Columbo straightened, brushing the soil from his gloves. He glanced at his watch. 10:37 on a Thursday morning. Nothing unusual about emergency vehicles in the world, but in this corner of Provence, they were rare enough to notice. The sirens continued for another minute, then stopped. Columbo returned to his tomatoes, but his mind was no longer entirely on the work. It was a peculiar habit of his, this attentiveness to disruption. 35 years of training didn't simply vanish because a man decided to grow vegetable instead. By late afternoon, Margot Devereaux from the village had called. She ran the small tabac near the square and was connected to the local gossip network in a way that would have been invaluable to any detective. She told him about the body found at the Castellane Villa, the grand house that sat on the hillside overlooking 3 valleys. She told him about the police cars and the gendarmes milling about looking confused. She told him the dead man was British, wealthy, and apparently very dead indeed. Columbo thanked her, promised to buy his tobacco from her shop, and hung up the phone. He stood in his cottage kitchen, looking at the simple dinner he'd been preparing. Vegetable soup, bread from the village baker, a glass of wine. It could wait. The gendarmerie station in Aix was a modest building with blue shutters and the air of a place where the most pressing concerns were usually parking violations and the occasional bicycle theft. Captain Laurent Marchand stood in the doorway when Columbo arrived, looking as though he'd been hoping the American wouldn't actually show up. Monsieur Columbo, Marchand said, his French accent thick but his English competent. We did not expect you so quickly. I was in the neighborhood, Columbo replied, which was technically true. He was always in the neighborhood now. Margot at the Tebec mentioned something about an incident at the Castellan place. Marchand's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It is a sensitive matter. The victim is a British citizen of some importance. We have already begun our investigation. I'm sure you have, Columbo said gently. But you called me. That tells me something about how confident you're feeling. The captain's shoulders dropped slightly. He gestured for Columbo to follow him inside. The Castellane villa was exactly what Columbo had imagined. High ceilings, expensive furniture, art on the walls that probably required insurance policies thicker than telephone books. The body of Edward Castellane lay in the study, sprawled across an expensive Persian rug, a small hole in his temple that suggested a single, efficient gunshot. The wine glass beside him was still half full. The room smelled of old books and cordite. He was discovered this morning by his housekeeper, Marchand explained. Madame Renaud. She comes Mondays and Thursdays. She found him when she arrived at 8 o'clock. The doctor estimates he has been dead for approximately 12 to 14 hours. Shot once, close range. The gun has not been found. Columbo moved slowly around the room, taking in the details with the methodical attention of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The desk was neat, no signs of struggle. The French doors leading to the terrace were locked from the inside. There was a glass of wine on the side table and another glass, empty, on the desk. He was entertaining someone, Columbo said. It wasn't a question. Possibly, Marchand agreed. We have found no other body, no signs of forced entry. The housekeeper says nothing appears to be missing. Columbo turned to face the captain, who found him exactly as he is now, before anything was moved. The housekeeper. She called us immediately. We have disturbed nothing, except— Marchand paused. We moved him to check for signs of life, but he was clearly dead. Columbo nodded. He looked back at Edward Castellane's body. The man was perhaps 60, well preserved, dressed in expensive casual clothing. His hands were manicured. His watch was a Rolex. This was someone accustomed to comfort. Tell me about his life, Columbo said. Who was he? Who did he know? Who wanted him dead? Marchand looked uncomfortable. That is what we were hoping you might help us determine, monsieur. We have preliminary statements from the household staff, but this is not the kind of investigation we are equipped for. The politics of it, the connections. He trailed off. Columbo understood. A wealthy British collector with an expensive villa on the Côte d'Azur meant international complications. It meant people with money and influence and lawyers. It meant exactly the kind of case that small-town gendarme preferred to push upward. He looked around the study once more, at the bookshelves lined with first editions, at the paintings on the walls, at the dead man on the floor. 8 months. He'd had 8 months of peace. 8 months of garden soil under his fingernails and the simple rhythm of rural life. He turned back to Captain Marchand. I'll need to speak with the housekeeper first, and then I'll need a list of everyone who was in this villa in the past week. Everyone. Staff, visitors, delivery men, everyone. Marchand nodded with visible relief. Of course, we can begin immediately. Columbo walked to the window and looked out at the Provençal landscape, the rolling hills turning purple in the late afternoon light. Somewhere in this beautiful place, someone had decided that Edward Castellane needed to die. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Lieutenant Columbo had a mystery to solve. Marchand led Columbo through the villa's main corridor, past oil paintings that looked like they'd been selected by someone with more money than taste. The lieutenant's wrinkled raincoat seemed out of place against the polished marble and fresh flowers, but he barely seemed to notice. He was too busy studying the photographs on the walls. Edward Castellane in a tuxedo. Edward Castellane with a sailboat. Edward Castellane with a woman who wasn't his wife. Your first interview should be with Madame Castellane, Marchand suggested. She's in the drawing room. She's been holding up remarkably well, considering the circumstances. Columbo paused at a mirror to adjust his tie, a gesture that seemed almost apologetic. Yeah, well, shock does funny things to people. Sometimes the ones who cry aren't the ones who feel it most, if you know what I mean. Madame Isabelle Castellane was exactly what Columbo expected and nothing like what he'd anticipated. She sat in a high-backed chair near the window, her dark hair arranged with the kind of precision that suggested she'd had a stylist come by despite her husband's death. She was perhaps 35, maybe younger, with the kind of bone structure that made age difficult to determine. Her black dress was impeccably tailored. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. Lieutenant Columbo, she said, extending a hand. I've been expecting you, though I must say, I imagined the French police would handle this matter. Columbo took her hand gently. French police will be handling most of it, ma'am. I'm just here to help out. Sometimes it's useful to have fresh eyes, you know? Eyes that don't know the local players. He settled into a chair across from her, producing a small notebook that had seen better days. I'm very sorry for your loss, madame. I know this must be difficult. Yes, she said, her accent precise and cultured. Edward and I had been married for 8 years. We were very happy. 8 years, Columbo repeated, writing it down slowly. That's a good stretch. Did you met here on the Côte d'Azur or back in the States? In New York. At a gallery opening. Edward was a collector, and I was working in the art world at the time. We fell in love very quickly. Columbo nodded, making a note. And you've been living here at the villa how long? 5 years. Edward decided he wanted to be closer to the Mediterranean. He said it inspired him. He was always looking for new pieces to add to his collection. Right. Speaking of which, where were you yesterday afternoon, ma'am? Around 4 o'clock? Isabel's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. I was here, in the villa. I took a walk in the garden in the morning, came back for lunch, and spent the afternoon reading in my room. Alone? Yes. Edward had gone into Antibes for a business meeting. He didn't return until evening. Columbo wrote this down, then looked up with an expression of genuine curiosity. What was he meeting about? You know anything about his business? Not in detail. Edward preferred to keep his professional life separate. I know he was involved in importing art and antiquities. He had contacts all over Europe. And the two of you got along okay? No arguments, nothing like that? Isabel's composure cracked slightly. We were married, Lieutenant. All marriages have their difficulties. But I loved Edward, and he loved me. Before Columbo could respond, Marchand appeared in the doorway. Monsieur Castellane's business partner is here, Monsieur Devereux. Should I send him in? Columbo stood. Thanks, ma'am. I appreciate your time. I'm sure we'll talk again. Laurent Devereux was everything Isabel wasn't. He was loud, anxious, and his handshake was damp with nervous sweat. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of tan that suggested either constant sun exposure or a bottle. His suit was expensive, but worn carelessly. This is a disaster, he said before even sitting down. A complete disaster. Edward and I had a deal pending, 50,000 euros. It was supposed to close next week. Columbo settled back into his chair. That's a lot of money, Mr. Devereux. What kind of deal? A painting, a Monet. Pre-war, very rare. Edward was supposed to authenticate it and arrange the sale. My client was paying a commission for his expertise. And now? Now I have to explain to my client that the deal is dead. The painting is in Edward's vault, probably locked up tight. The legal complications are going to be a nightmare. Columbo made notes. You must have been pretty frustrated with him. Devereux's face flushed. What are you implying? Nothing, sir. Just that losing 50,000 euros would frustrate most people. Where were you yesterday afternoon? I was in my office in Cannes. I have 3 employees who can verify that. We were preparing documentation for the sale. What time did you leave? Around 6 o'clock. I drove directly here to meet with Edward. When I arrived, I found him. I found him in the study. The police were already here. Columbo studied him for a long moment. You drove straight here? Nobody saw you between 6 and whenever you arrived? No, it's a 30-minute drive. I listened to the radio. What station? Devereux blinked. I don't remember. Whatever was on. The third person Marchand brought in was younger, perhaps 30, with the casual elegance of someone born to money. His name was Philippe Rousseau, and he'd been staying at the villa for 2 weeks. I'm an old friend of Edward's, he explained, crossing his legs with unconscious grace. We knew each other at university. I'm between residences at the moment, so Edward invited me to stay. That was generous, Columbo said. You must have been close. We were, yes, though I hadn't seen Edward in several years before this visit. So why now? Why did he invite you to stay? Philippe hesitated. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. Edward called me out of the blue, said it would be nice to catch up. I assumed he was feeling nostalgic. Where were you yesterday afternoon? I took a boat out. I went sailing alone. I left around 1 o'clock and returned around 5:30. Anyone see you? Not that I'm aware of. I went quite far out to sea. It's peaceful out there. Columbo closed his notebook and stood. Thank you all for your time. I'm sure we'll be talking more as the investigation continues. As he walked back to his car, Columbo paused to look at the villa one more time. 3 people with alibis, 3 people with reasons to want Edward Castelaine dead, and 3 stories that didn't quite add up the way they should. He got into his car and sat for a moment, thinking about what he'd heard. Somewhere in those carefully constructed stories was a crack. and cracks, in Columbo's experience, were exactly where the truth liked to hide. The morning sun painted the Côte d'Azur in shades of gold and turquoise as Columbo made his way back to the Castellan villa. He'd spent half the night reviewing his notes, the other half thinking about what wasn't in them. The widow had been adamant nothing was stolen, but something about that insistence had the quality of a door being slammed just a little too hard. He found Madame Castellan in the garden, sitting beneath a pergola draped in bougainvillea. She looked smaller in daylight, diminished somehow, though her posture remained rigid. She didn't rise when he approached. "Madame," Columbo said, settling into a chair across from her with the careful movements of a man who knew he was trespassing. "I hope you're bearing up. These things, they take time." She inclined her head slightly. "The police have been thorough, Lieutenant. I believe they have everything they need." "Well, that's the funny thing," Columbo said, pulling out a wrinkled notebook. "I was thinking about something you mentioned yesterday. You said your husband kept his more valuable pieces in the wall safe, in the study." "Yes, insurance purposes. He was always concerned about security." Columbo nodded slowly. "Right, right. Very sensible. The thing is, when I was looking at the study this morning, I noticed the safe was in perfect condition. No signs of tampering. Beautiful craftsmanship, really. French, I'd guess, from the 1930s? "I wouldn't know," Madame Castellan said. Her fingers had gone very still in her lap. "See, I had a chat with the officer who processed the scene," Columbo continued, his voice taking on the rambling quality of a man thinking out loud. "And he mentioned something interesting. The safe was open when they arrived. Not broken into, just open, like someone had the combination. My husband kept it locked," she said quietly. "I'm sure he did. That's what I figured. So I got to wondering, who would have had access to that combination? A wife, probably. Maybe a trusted employee. Maybe someone who'd been around long enough to notice him opening it, writing down the numbers." He paused, looking at her with genuine curiosity. "Did your husband have the combination written down anywhere?" "In his desk," Madame Castellan said. Her voice had become very thin. "In a sealed envelope, for emergencies. And that envelope is still there?" She didn't answer. Columbo waited, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Finally, she rose abruptly and walked back into the villa. He followed at a distance, watching as she led him to the study. She went directly to the desk, opened a drawer, and removed a sealed envelope. It was still sealed. "I haven't touched it since Edward's death," she said. "I saw no reason to." Columbo took it gently, felt its weight. But someone else did touch it, didn't they? Someone knew about it, and they opened it. They got the combination to that safe. Madame Castellan's face had gone the color of old parchment. There was nothing of value in there, only papers, some jewelry, insurance documents. No paintings? The word hung in the air between them. She turned away, moving to the window that overlooked the Mediterranean. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "My husband bought a Monet 3 years ago. It was supposed to be a surprise for my birthday. He was always finding treasures, always adding to the collection." She paused. "But there was a problem." "What kind of problem?" "He discovered it was a forgery." Columbo felt something click into place, like a key turning in a lock. "When did he discover this?" "About 6 months ago. He had it examined by a specialist in Paris. The man was very discreet, but the conclusion was certain. It was a very good forgery, but a forgery nonetheless." She turned back to face him. "My husband became obsessed with finding out where it had come from, who had painted it. He contacted dealers, collectors, insurance agents. He was determined to expose whoever had sold it to him. And that made him enemies." "Yes," she said simply, "very dangerous ones." Columbo moved to the safe, steadying it with new understanding. "So the painting was in here, and someone took it." "Yes. 2 weeks before Edward died." "You reported it?" "No." She returned to the desk and sat heavily. "I wanted to, but Edward refused. He said it would complicate matters. He said he was close to finding the people responsible, and if they knew he discovered the theft, they might disappear. He wanted to catch them in the act. Instead, they caught him," Columbo said quietly. The implications were settling over the villa like dust. Someone in the art world had killed Edward Castellone, someone who dealt in forgeries, who had too much to lose if a man of Castellone's standing started making noise about a forgery ring, someone who had already stolen the painting to cover their tracks, and when that wasn't enough, when Castellone kept asking questions, kept making calls, kept getting closer to the truth, they decided he needed to be silenced permanently. "Do you know who sold him the painting?" Columbo asked. "There was a dealer, a man named Marchand. He had a gallery in Monaco. Edward was trying to locate him when he died." "And did he?" "I don't know. Edward kept his investigation private. He didn't tell me details. He said the less I knew, the safer I'd be." She looked at Columbo with hollow eyes. "I see now that he was right about that, at least." Columbo closed his notebook. The widow's story had the weight of truth to it, but it was truth with edges. She'd lied about the painting, lied about the theft, which meant she'd been protecting someone or protecting something. He needed to find this Marchand. He needed to understand the scope of the forgery ring, and he needed to figure out whether the widow was a victim of circumstance or something considerably more calculated. As he left the study, he paused at the doorway. "Madame, one more thing. You said the painting was a gift for your birthday, but you never actually received it as a gift, did you? It was a secret, something he kept hidden." "Yes," she said, "that's correct." "I wonder," Columbo said, almost to himself, "if there are other secrets he kept, other paintings, other discoveries, things that might matter." He descended the marble staircase with the slow, thoughtful gait of a man who had just realized the case was far larger and far more dangerous than he'd initially supposed. Somewhere in the shadowy world of Mediterranean art dealers and forgers, there was a connection waiting to be made, and Columbo had the distinct feeling that when he finally made it, everything would change. The shadow of suspicion had already begun to settle over Philippe Arnaud's shoulders by the time Columbo returned to the Nice police headquarters the following morning. He could see it in the way Inspector Devereaux stood at the window of his cramped office, arms crossed, jaw set tight with the impatience of a man who'd waited long enough. "We have enough," Devereaux said without preamble. The business partner had access, motive, and opportunity. The wife's testimony about their arguments is solid. The insurance policy alone would give him €500,000. Columbo stood in the doorway, his rumpled suit catching the Mediterranean light streaming through the Venetian blinds. He rubbed his face slowly, as if trying to wake from a dream he couldn't quite shake. "Inspector, I wonder if I might ask you something," Columbo said. "That wine glass we found in the study, the one beside Rousseau's body?" Devereaux sighed, the sound of a man rehearsing patience he no longer possessed. "What about it?" "Well, I had the lab run the residue again. There were traces of a particular vintage Chateauneuf du Pape. Expensive stuff. The kind you don't find in most households, even the wealthy ones." Columbo stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "I spoke with Arnaud's chef this morning. She says Monsieur Arnaud prefers Bordeaux. Always has. She's been with the family for 12 years. "People change their preferences," Devereaux said flatly. "They do," Columbo agreed. "But the thing that keeps bothering me is the fingerprints, or rather, the lack of them. The glass had been wiped clean, very clean, almost professionally clean." He moved to the window and gazed out at the glittering sea beyond the rooftops. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a tired-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, the kind of man who didn't belong in this world of Riviera elegance and Mediterranean intrigue. "Arnaud's a businessman," Columbo continued. "Sharp, careful. But would he really think to wipe a wine glass clean while leaving the rest of the crime scene untouched? While leaving his own shoes tracked through the blood on the floor?" He turned back to face the inspector. "No, I don't think he would." Devereaux rose from his desk, his frustration now visible in the set of his shoulders. "So what are you suggesting? That someone framed him?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Columbo said quietly. "I'm just following the small things, the details that don't quite fit the picture we're painting." Over the next 3 days, Columbo returned to the Rousseau estate again and again. He spoke with the servants, each time asking different questions, each time listening not just to what they said, but to how they said it. He walked the grounds at different times of day, noting how the light fell through the windows, how the sound traveled through the corridors. It was the gardener, an elderly man named Lucien, who finally gave him something. They were standing near the side entrance of the house, the one that led through the kitchens to the study. "The telephone," Lucien said, seemingly out of nowhere. "I remember now. The day Monsieur Rousseau died. There was a man here in the morning. Not Monsieur Arnaud, a different man. He came through the back, and he used the telephone in the study." "How do you know he used the telephone?" Columbo asked. "Because I heard him," Lucien said. "I was working near the window. I heard him speaking, angry, something about the paintings, about fixing the problem." Lucien's weathered face creased with the effort of remembering. "Then he left, and an hour later, Monsieur Rousseau was dead." Columbo's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice level. "Can you describe this man?" "Thin, dark hair, well-dressed, foreign accent, not French." Lucien paused. "He had a scar, just here." The old man traced a line along his left temple. That night, Columbo sat in his modest hotel room and spread out the photographs and documents he'd accumulated. He'd been looking at the surface of the crime, at the obvious suspects and the convenient motive. But the small details, the wine glass, the phone call, the servant's testimony, they were telling a different story. He pulled out the guest list from the auction house where Rousseau had worked. There, a man named Marcello Russo, Italian, described as a collector and consultant, and in a photograph from a society event 3 years prior, there was a man with a thin face, dark hair, and a thin white line running down his left temple. Columbo called Devereaux at his home, knowing the inspector would be irritated, but not caring. "I need you to bring in Marcello Russo for questioning," Columbo said without greeting. "Who the hell is Marcello Russo?" Devereaux demanded. "The man who really killed Rousseau," Columbo said. "And I think if you check the records, you'll find that Rousseau and Rousseau had a history. Something to do with forged paintings. I think Rousseau came to the house that morning, made a phone call to threaten Rousseau into silence, and when Rousseau refused, when he threatened to go to the authorities, Rousseau killed him." There was a long silence on the line. Then Devereaux said, "We have no evidence of this man's involvement." "Not yet," Columbo said. "But if you bring him in, if you ask him about that phone call, about his relationship with Rousseau, about where he was that afternoon, I think you'll find the evidence. I think you'll find that Rousseau used Arnaud's wine, Arnaud's study, and Arnaud's position as a suspect to cover his tracks." The next morning, when Rousseau was brought in for questioning, he cracked within 2 hours. The small details had led Columbo to the truth, just as they always did. The wine glass, the phone call, the servant's testimony, the scar on a man's temple, these were the threads that, when pulled gently but persistently, unraveled the entire fabric of the lie. As Columbo watched from behind the glass partition of the interrogation room, he thought about what had drawn him to police work all those years ago. It wasn't the grand gestures or the dramatic confrontations. It was this, the patient accumulation of small truths, the belief that if you paid attention to the details, if you listened to what the crime scene was trying to tell you, justice would eventually emerge from the shadows. Philippe Arnaud would walk free. The real killer would face justice, and Columbo would move on to the next puzzle, the next set of small details waiting to be noticed by someone patient enough to look. That patience would be tested one final time on a warm Mediterranean evening, when Columbo arranged for everyone to gather in the drawing room of the Arnaud villa. The light was turning golden, slanting through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Madame Arnaud sat rigid in a wingback chair, her lawyer beside her, fingers drumming against his leather briefcase. Across from her, Philippe occupied a smaller chair, his posture casual in a way that seemed almost defiant. Detective Rousseau stood by the mantelpiece, and in the corner, looking distinctly uncomfortable, sat Bernard Leclerc, the business partner, who had arrived at the villa with visible reluctance. Columbo entered last, moving with that peculiar shuffling gait that somehow commanded the room's attention. His raincoat hung over his chair. He held a cup of coffee that Mrs. Arnaud's housekeeper had made for him. He sipped it slowly, deliberately, as if the taste required his full concentration. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice quiet but carrying weight. "I know this isn't pleasant. Nobody likes sitting in a room while a detective talks about their case, but I've got something figured out, and I think you all deserve to hear it. Fair's fair. That's important to me." He set down the coffee cup on a side table and pulled out a small notebook, though he didn't look at it. He rarely did. "Let me start with what we know," Columbo said. "Monsieur Arnaud was killed here in the villa. He was poisoned. The poison was administered in his evening brandy, the one he drank every night at 9 o'clock, alone in his study. No one disputes this. It's the facts that matter. The facts are clean." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering just a moment longer on Philippe than on the others. "Now, here's where it gets interesting. We found evidence of a forgery scheme, a very sophisticated one. Monsieur Arnaud was going to expose it. He was going to the authorities the morning after he died. We found the letter in his desk, unsigned, unfinished, but the intent was clear." Columbo paused. "The scheme involved creating false documents to divert company funds. A lot of money, millions of francs." Bernard Leclerc shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His jaw tightened. "The forger was very good," Columbo continued, "almost professional quality. Which brings me to Philippe Arnaud." He turned to the young man. "You studied art restoration in Paris, didn't you? And before that, you worked in a document authentication lab. You have the skills, you have the knowledge." Philippe's expression didn't change, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair just a little tighter. "But here's the thing," Columbo said, and now he was pacing slowly, his hands clasped before him. "You didn't do this alone. You couldn't have. You needed access to the company's legitimate documents, their templates, their security features. You needed someone on the inside, someone with authority, someone like a business partner." He stopped in front of Bernard Leclerc. "Monsieur Leclerc, you and Monsieur Arnaud built that company together over 20 years. You knew every system, every process, and about 6 months ago, when your investment portfolio took a hit, when your daughter's medical treatments became very expensive, you started thinking about shortcuts, about ways to solve your problems without waiting for the market to turn around." "This is absurd," Leclerc said, but his voice wavered. "I demand to speak with my attorney." "Of course you do," Columbo said mildly. "That's your right. But let me finish, because the next part is the important part, the part about murder." He turned back to Philippe. "You and Monsieur Leclerc worked together on the forgery. Madame Arnaud knew about it too. She was going to benefit from it. When her husband died, the inheritance, combined with the diverted funds, would have made her very wealthy indeed, very comfortable in her widow's years. Madame Arnaud's lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently in her ear, but she waved him away, staring at Columbo with an intensity that suggested she wanted to hear every word. "But here's what I think happened," Columbo said. "Monsieur Arnaud discovered the scheme. Maybe he found a document he shouldn't have. Maybe he noticed something in the accounts. It doesn't matter. He discovered it, and he was going to report it. He was going to destroy his partner. He was going to expose his wife's involvement. And for Monsieur Leclerc, that meant not just financial ruin. It meant prison. It meant his reputation, his legacy, everything gone." Leclerc's face had gone pale. "So Monsieur Leclerc did something desperate," Columbo said. "He came here that evening. He had a key to the villa. Monsieur Arnaud trusted him. He always did. And Leclerc put the poison in the brandy. He knew the routine. He knew his partner would drink it at 9 o'clock. "You have no proof," Leclerc said, but the words came out hollow. "Actually," Columbo said, "I do. We found traces of the poison in a handkerchief in your car, just tiny amounts. You tried to clean it up, but you missed a spot. And we have a witness who saw you near the villa that evening, the gardener from next door. He thought it was odd, you being here so late, in the dark." Columbo walked to the window and looked out at the darkening Mediterranean. "Here's what I think will happen," he said softly. "Monsieur Leclerc will be charged with murder. The evidence is strong. Madame Arnaud and Philippe will face charges related to the forgery scheme, but the murder charge won't stick. They didn't know what Leclerc was planning. They didn't want Monsieur Arnaud dead. They just wanted the money." He turned back to face them. "That's not a defense, of course. Not really. But it matters. In the law, intent matters, and I don't think they intended to kill anyone." He picked up his coffee cup again and took another sip. "There's just one more thing," he said, and the familiar phrase hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. "Monsieur Leclerc, I need to ask you something. When you put the poison in that brandy, did you think about the 20 years you'd known him? Did you think about all the deals you'd made together, all the times he'd trusted you? Or did you just think about your daughter's medical bills and your portfolio and how you couldn't face the idea of losing everything?" Leclerc didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. Columbo nodded slowly, as if Leclerc had spoken volumes. "I think," Columbo said quietly, "that's all I need to know." The silence that followed Leclerc's non-answers seemed to stretch across the interrogation room like a living thing. Columbo watched the man's shoulders sag, watched the last bit of fight drain from his eyes, and felt that familiar weight settle into his chest. It was the weight that came after every case, after every moment when a person's life fractured into before and after, and there was no going back to repair it. He stood, his knees creaking slightly as he rose from the metal chair. Across the table, Leclerc didn't look up. The financier just stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were foreign instruments that had acted without his consent. But they hadn't. That was the terrible truth of it. They had acted exactly as he'd intended. Columbo collected his notes, shuffling them into a folder with deliberate slowness. He'd learned long ago that these final moments mattered. The way a detective left a room told a suspect as much as any accusation. He wanted Leclerc to understand that this wasn't personal, that it was simply the way things worked. Action and consequence, choice and result. The machinery of justice grinding forward, indifferent and inexorable. "The gendarmes will take it from here," Columbo said, not unkindly. "You'll want a lawyer, a good one. I'd recommend someone who specializes in financial crime. They'll know the system better than someone who doesn't." Leclerc finally looked up. There was something almost grateful in his expression, as if Columbo's practical advice was the last human kindness he expected to receive. Maybe it was. The drive back to the cottage took him through the winding roads of the Côte d'Azur as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening. The Mediterranean caught the sun's reflection and threw it back in 1,000 shattered pieces of gold. Columbo drove with the windows down, letting the salt-tinged air wash over him. It helped, somehow. The wind, the smell of the sea, the reminder that the world was larger than any single crime, any single tragedy. He thought about Leclerc's daughter. She'd be learning soon, if she hadn't already, what her father had done. That knowledge would reshape her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. It would become the central fact of her existence, the thing that colored every achievement and accomplishment with an asterisk. He was sorry for that. Columbo had never enjoyed the collateral damage that came with solving murders, the innocent people who got caught in the undertow. But that was the nature of the work. You couldn't untangle a crime without pulling on all the threads, and sometimes good people got hurt in the process. Sometimes that was the price of justice. The cottage greeted him as it always did, with its weathered shutters and the smell of rosemary growing wild in the garden. Columbo parked the Peugeot and sat for a moment in the driveway, not quite ready to go inside. His garden was waiting for him. The tomatoes would need tending, the roses had begun to bloom, and he wanted to deadhead them before the evening dew set in. He changed into his worn gardening clothes and spent an hour moving through the rows with his pruning shears, working with the methodical patience that always soothed him. The repetitive motions, the simple clarity of the work, the tangible results, all of it helped to quiet the noise in his mind. By the time the sun had sunk lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, he felt something like equilibrium returning. Inside the cottage, Columbo poured himself a glass of wine. A local Côte de Provence, nothing fancy, but it was good and honest, and it tasted like home. He settled into his chair by the window, where he could see the last of the day's light fading over the garden, and allowed himself a moment of genuine satisfaction. Leclerc was in custody. The case was closed. Justice, however imperfect, had been served. He was on his second glass when the telephone rang. Columbo didn't move immediately. He let it ring 3 times, as if by not answering quickly, he could somehow refuse whatever it was about to ask of him. But of course, that was never how it worked. The phone kept ringing. The world kept turning. There was always another case, always another death that needed explaining. He set down his wine glass and crossed to the telephone. Monsieur Columbo? The voice on the other end was formal, official. A gendarme, then. This is Captain Arnaud from the Marseille precinct. I'm sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation that requires your attention. Columbo closed his eyes for a moment. A situation. A murder, the captain said. A prominent businessman found in his home this morning. The local investigators are stumped. I've heard good things about your work. Would you be willing to consult? There it was, the weight again, descending like a net. Columbo looked out the window at his garden, at the shadows lengthening across the rows of vegetables and flowers. He thought about his wine, about the evening he'd planned to spend in quiet solitude, about the simple pleasure of being left alone to tend his garden and watch the stars emerge over the Mediterranean. Tell me about it, he heard himself say. Captain Arnaud launched into the details. A man named Vero, a shipping magnate, found stabbed in his study. No signs of forced entry, no obvious motive. The family was cooperating, but something didn't add up. The captain's voice carried the particular frustration of a good cop confronting a puzzle he couldn't solve. Columbo listened, and as he listened, he felt the familiar machinery of his mind begin to engage. The questions started forming. The inconsistencies began to stand out. His tired mind, which moments ago had been settling into the peace of evening, suddenly came alive with the peculiar energy that only a mystery could provide. I'll need to see the scene, Columbo said. When can you get here? Columbo looked at his wine glass, at the cottage that had welcomed him home, at the garden that would still be there when he returned. If he returned. There was always another case. There was always another death. Give me an hour, he said. I'll drive down to Marseille tonight. He hung up the phone and stood for a moment in the gathering darkness of his cottage. Then he finished his wine in a single, long swallow, set the glass down carefully, and went to pack his bag. The cottage would wait. The garden would wait. They always did. And somewhere in Marseille, a puzzle was waiting to be solved, a truth waiting to be uncovered, a killer waiting to be caught. Columbo picked up his coat and headed for the door.